Bula and welcome to The Lens at 177. Today we're going to discuss, amongst other things, value-added tax, the economic situation in Fiji, challenges that could possibly be faced by ordinary Fijians and everyone in general with the upcoming budget, what people have been saying on the street and in the Fiji Times about what they expect from the budget. And we're speaking to someone who's spent a lot of time in dialogue. He's the executive director of Dialogue Fiji, Nilesh. Bula Nilesh.
Bula Felix, thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. Nilesh, we'll start with the upcoming budget, the 2023-2024 budget. Everyone is looking forward to it for whatever reason, but for the ordinary Fijians, it's always about cost of living, health and education. These are the three key factors that we've discovered in our discussions with ordinary Fijians out on the street. So I'll just start with some of your suggestions and recommendations that you had given during the National Economic Summit. If you could just give us a bit of background on that.
Yeah, I think what I have insisted all along is that for a developing state like Fiji, it has always got to be expansionary budgets that the state needs to deliver. In fact, I've argued that the idea that private sector can take over the public sector and be able to continue the growth momentum of the economy is fundamentally flawed. There's also evidence from other small island developing states, and so the state will need to continue to play a very significant role when it comes to growing the economy, and also in fulfilling the needs and expectations of the people. Right. One of the things that we have seen happen in the under the reign of the previous government is that the expectations of the people have actually grown, because the previous government was implementing a lot of populist policies, and then they were also able to sustain them over so many years.
But it ended up in debt.
Yeah, so that is another issue. Maybe we'll get back. We'll get to it later. But what I'm saying is that the expectations of the people from the government always, and in recent years it has become rather high. So one of the expectations always, of course, of people will be that the government will provide them relief in as far as cost of living is concerned. Now, the cost of living in Fiji and the inflation that we might have seen happen in recent time is something that will be largely attributable to external factors. So the inflation that we are encountering is largely imported inflation. It's not due to demand pull factors. So if you look at it, there's very little that the government can actually do when it comes to harnessing inflation, because all the fiscal and even monetary policy measures that are there are geared at reducing cost of living. Right. Essentially, there's so much relief that the government is already providing. So maybe the expectation this time would be that this new government will retain most of those measures, and then those relief that is afforded to the people in terms of lower taxes, in terms of VAT exemption on certain basic food items, in terms of relatively high tax threshold. So I think if you talk to the people in the field, and then that is the sort of expectations that they are articulating. Yeah, so I think that will also in a very significant way impact how the people perceive the performance of the new government. Right. Because for the ordinary Joe, civil and political rights perhaps do not matter as much as the economic needs.
Yes.
So that is true for a sizable proportion of our population. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of expectations that the government will need to meet, right? And then they have to perhaps carefully balance it with their own economic approaches and philosophies. Because so far what the new government is articulated, what we make out of their economic approach is that they want to balance the budget. Yes. They want to address the public debt situation. They want to address budget deficits. Yes. So it will then become a very difficult balancing act for the finance minister and for the finance ministry, and I think the entire government machinery. Yes. Yeah. But one of the good things, I mean, if you look at the statistics and the latest economic review that has been released by the Reserve Bank of Fiji, I think we're in a rather good place. If you look at the macroeconomic indicators, they're very positive. Last year we have encountered a growth, a rate of growth that has exceeded all expectations. Right. So the government had forecasted, I think, around 12% of growth. Yes. Then it was revised upwards to 15%, and from what I gather from the Reserve Bank statistics, it has now surpassed. Their estimate is that the growth rate was more than 18%, around 18.6% in the last fiscal year. So, and that is phenomenal. So that has happened because of the resurgence of tourism. Right. And the good thing is that trend has continued. So I think in the last quarter, the number of visitors that came to Fiji actually exceeded 2019 figures. So right. 2019 is the pre-pandemic figures. Yes. So I think more than 252,000 people came to Fiji in the last 4 months. Yes. And that is huge, because you have the tourism sector, and then just because of the spillovers also from the tourism sector into the other sectors, it is really impacting in a very positive way on the entire economy. So if you look at it, all the indicators are very positive.
Is this because of the previous government's policies?
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, definitely there were policies that were very supportive of the tourism sector that were implemented by the previous government, right? So and that has contributed to this growth. There has been a resurgence. In fact, there has been a lot of travel intent also on the part of travelers in the traditional markets, whether this be Australia, New Zealand, US. A lot of visitors also coming to Fiji are relatives of people, or their local residents also returning, people that couldn't travel in the last couple of years. So all that is obviously contributing to this huge number of people that are coming. But we can't discount the fact that the previous government also put in a set of very supportive policies as far as the tourism industry was concerned, so which also allowed the tourism players, the hotels and other people that constitute the tourism sector. It allowed them to stay afloat. It allowed them, the major concessions, for instance, there were huge there were huge tax reductions. The service turnover tax, it was reduced from 5% to 6% to 0%. Then we had the ECAL, for instance, that was reduced from 10% to 5%. So all of these obviously were very supportive, very beneficial to the tourism sector, although these in a very large way also impacted on government revenue. Right. So that's why I wrote an article which was published in the Fiji Times some months ago, where I insisted that instead of the government focusing on trying to increase its revenue through measures such as VAT increase or decrease in the tax threshold, instead it could consider reimposing some of these taxes on the tourism industry. Because
we'll come back to that. We'll just cut to a short break, and we'll be back with you on the lens at 177.
We were around when the deed was first signed. We were around when the first car engine roared. We were around when the very first was crowned. Through devastations, jubilant celebrations, and the milestones. We will continue to be around, to bring you all the stories first.
Welcome back to The Lens at 177. We were having an interesting discussion with Nilesh, the Executive Director of Dialogue Fiji. We were speaking about reintroducing some of the taxes that you had just mentioned in the last episode. Could you just go into a bit more detail with that?
Yeah, so this, what I meant was the potential for some increase in particularly in the tourism sector, because we need to be mindful of the fact that there are major concessions that were given, tax concessions that were given to the tourism sector during the pandemic. So now that we have a situation where the sector is doing very well, there's been a huge resurgence, and in fact the rate of recovery has exceeded expectations. So one of the things that we need to be mindful of in relation to our tourism sector is that a lot of tourism operators are foreigners. Right. So if they make super profits, which they'd be able to do if we don't tax them appropriately, right, then there's this possibility that a lot of those earnings would be siphoned off from the economy, which we don't want to happen.
Right. Right?
Yeah, and so we do not really need to, we need to avoid a situation where these operators are able to make super profits. Right? That is why there's a very strong rationale for having an appropriate level of taxing. So for instance, when the government removed the service turnover tax, so it resulted in about a $19 million loss for the government in terms of revenue in one fiscal year. Similarly, if you look at the ECAL, so ECAL in the pre-COVID times was raking in around 160 million in revenue, and that's very significant. Yes. So when it was drastically reduced, then all that revenue was gone. Right. So now the government is saying that it needs to increase its revenue. Yes. Right. So is it better for the government to increase its revenue by taxing the ordinary people, or lowering the tax threshold? Right. Which essentially just affects the people earning at the lower end of the strata, right, or is it better for government to tax those businesses that are now in a position where they are able to make hefty profits, right? Right. So that's the rationale, because we need to generate revenue. In the recent past, there has been very large budget deficits. So eventually, the government will have to sort of narrow its deficits. Now, what I'm saying is that it shouldn't happen drastically, right? So the government shouldn't feel pressured that there's a need to drastically reduce the budget deficit right in the next budget, which is the budget for the fiscal year 23-24, right? Instead, it needs to gradually reduce the deficit budget. And one of the things that the government should not do, I would strongly advise against that, is to attempt to deliver a balanced budget, because that simply does not work in developing states. In developing economies, we need to continue to have expansionary budgets, which means that government expenditure would always exceed government revenue. Right. And the whole idea is to create the right conditions and provide resources to grow the economy.
So just to so our viewers understand, you're saying maybe tax increases for the tourism sector, as opposed to imposing VAT on essential food items that will affect the people in the low income bracket.
That's right. I think that is always going to be a very controversial proposal in Fiji, the increasing VAT, which is going to disproportionately perhaps affect the poor people, because poor people have a lower purchasing power to begin with. So that, any attempts to do that would be met with strong popular disapproval, I'd say. However, one of the things that might be considered is to have a single VAT rate.
Right.
So I think that is something that is perhaps also desirable, because it will also uncomplicate a lot of matters. For instance, administration of tax, especially VAT. So, but we're definitely not in favor of increasing VAT to 15%. So if we're going to have a uniform rate, what we had recommended, that perhaps we can have a 10% VAT rate for everything.
Even on the essential food items that are zero rated at the moment, even on that?
Yes, that might not be a bad idea, because if you look at the essential items and the quantity of essential items that are bought, perhaps if you take the grocery shopping for a year for a rich household and for a poor household, so the rich household would actually be buying more of those zero rated VAT, which means that the government is subsidizing VAT for a rich household more than it is actually doing for a poor household. So in that way, that is not very progressive form of taxation. Right? So it might be, there are definite benefits to having a single VAT rate.
Okay. So there's always the argument that if you're going to impose, say, 10%, as you suggested, what happens to those who are on the margins of society, the low-income earners? How will they'll be the hardest hit? They're not earning as much, and many of them are struggling at the moment, even with zero-rated items. How would they be affected or assisted?
Okay. Well, it will essentially become an austerity measure for them.
Right.
But if you look at what the narrative has been from government, is that okay, we have this very sizable public debt and we need to increase government revenue. That is why some of these proposals are being entertained, right, in the public discourse. Right? Ideally, of course, we do not want to be imposing measures that are going to affect the poor disproportionately. Right? But if that is to be considered, then I think the best thing that can be done is to provide targeted measures for these households. Now, how that can be done is also a matter of of great consideration. Right? Usually, states that distributive policies are mostly they become embroiled in controversy because of how recipients are chosen, and so that is something that will have to be well thought about. But I think IMF has also made the suggestion that you increase VAT and then you provide targeted measures to just the poor households. But it's, as everybody knows, easier said than done.
Yes, thank you. We will take a short break and we'll be right back with the lines at 177.
We were around when the deed was first signed. We were around when the first car engine roared. We were around when the very first was crowned. Through devastations, jubilant celebrations, and the milestones. We will continue to be around to bring you all the stories first.
Bula, and welcome back to the Lens at 177. I'm speaking with the Executive Director of Dialogue Fiji, Nilesh, and we're going to move away from the discussion on the economy and VAT into something that's a bit more current and that people are following on social media and mainstream media as well, and that is the situation with the deregistration or the possible deregistration of political parties and the implications it could have for us as the people of Fiji. So, Nilesh, could you just share a little bit about what are some of the scenarios if political parties get deregistered?
Okay, so there are several possible resultant scenarios. should Fiji First get registered, deregistered. This for one, of course, in accordance with the provisions of the Political Parties Act, the Fiji First MPs in Parliament can choose to either become independent or they can become members of the existing parliamentary parties, which are essentially the People's Alliance Party, the National Federation Party, and the Social Democratic Liberal Party. Now, as you know, the People's Alliance Party needs about 7 MPs to have an absolute majority. So if it is able to induce 7 Fiji First MPs to join its ranks, then People's Alliance Party will begin to have an absolute majority in Parliament, which means that it will no longer require support from either the National Federation Party or SODELPA to continue to be able to form government. So it will essentially be able to form government on its own. Right? And the other scenario that could potentially arise is that these 26 MPs can then choose to support maybe the SODELPA leader to become Prime Minister. So if that happens, then SODELPA will be able to lead government. And then the similar situation can happen with the National Federation Party. So if these 26 MPs support the NFP leader to become Prime Minister, then NFP will be able to form government on its own. So these are the possible scenarios. Now, what will happen following the deregistration of the party? I mean, if it does happen for non-compliance with the political finance disclosure requirements, then if even a single member of Parliament that has been elected on the Fiji First ticket resigns from Parliament, it is going to trigger a by-election, because there would be no valid party list from which that vacant seat can be filled. Now in Fiji, just because we have a multi-member constituency, and then our constituency actually spans the entire country, that means that we will have to have a nationwide election, which is a more than $20 million exercise. We would essentially be having elections all over again, and that will continue to need to happen every time an MP that has been elected on the Fiji First ticket resigns. So for instance, one person resigns this month, the president will need to issue writ of elections within 7 days, fill that vacancy. So $20 million exercise, right? The elections office will need to, print ballots, set up polling stations, hold elections all over the country to fill that position.
Is this because of the way the Constitution was written?
It is because of the electoral system that we use, and the fact that under Section 64 of the Constitution, there's a requirement for by-elections every time it becomes impossible to fill a vacant seat in Parliament. Now that is very atypical in as far as a PR system is concerned. Normally in a PR system, if you take the case of New Zealand for instance, they've got a mixed system, but if you look at the closed-list PR system, if there's a vacancy and if it is not to be fulfilled, it is unable to be filled, then the seat remains vacant for the term of the Parliament, regardless of when the vacancy takes place. Now in Fiji, the Constitution requires by-elections, and then making it even more problematic is the fact that our constituency is the entire country. So the only way to fill that the only way to hold a by-election to fill that vacancy is to have everyone in the country vote. There's no two ways about it, right? Of course, there can be, since there'd be just a set single seat, then there might be perhaps ways in which this can be done in a cheaper way, but still it will cost quite significantly, right?
But just wanted to ask, so if the 26 members of Fiji First joined, say, People's Alliance Party, I'm just speaking hypothetically, does that mean National Federation Party and SODELPA will become the opposition?
Well, they could either choose to become government backbenchers with no real clout, or they can choose to move to the to the opposite side, right? But if Fiji first all the members become independent and then they join the government, then there would again be problems in as far as functioning of parliament is concerned, because I think there would be consensus on the fact that for a functioning democracy you need an opposition.
Yes.
Right? So yeah, so these are pretty problematic elements in their own respect. But well, in that event, since People's Alliance Party will begin to have an absolute majority on its own, obviously, you know, SODELPA and National Federation Party will lose whatever influence they have over government.
Right.
So they can choose to remain insignificant backbenchers, move to the opposite side.
And you know, with that happening, if it does happen, what does that mean for the country, for the people, for investor confidence? What does that mean?
Oh, there are huge ramifications, because the political system will become very fluid. One of the strengths of the Fijian political system has been the strength of its political parties, and that is fundamentally one of the ways that we have been differing from, for instance, our neighbors in Malaysia, Melanesia, like Vanuatu, PNG, for instance. But if we have this situation where there is you know, almost half the parliament has no party affiliation, so they're free to vote in whatever way they want. You know, of course, they can. It can lead to a situation where these 26 MPs can sell themselves to the highest bidder every time, you know, there's a specific issue, there's a legislation to be voted on. Right. That can happen. Right. But it will lead to a very fluid political culture. It will, or system, sorry, it is going to be a very unstable system, of course, unstable system. And the degree of instability that it will create is going to have, you know, very significant ramifications for the economy, right? Because there would be no predictability, there would be no uncertainty. Yes. And uncertainty is one thing that has a huge impact on economic activity. So yeah, so there are going to be very significant ramifications, not just for the political landscape, but also the economy as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nilesh, for sharing your insights with us. A lot of food for thought there, a lot of room for discussion. And we do hope to see Nilesh back with us at the Lens at 177, maybe to discuss the possible impacts of the possible deregistration of political parties in Fiji. Here from us at the Lens at 177, we like to say thank you. Thank you, Nilesh, for joining us. And please follow us on our website, www.fijitimes.com.fg, and also on our Facebook and YouTube channels.